At 3:47 in the afternoon on November 24, 1944, Major General Curtis LeMay stood on the tarmac at Isley Field on Saipan, watching the first formation of Boeing B-29 Superfortresses lift into the western sky toward Tokyo. The aircraft climbed slowly, heavily loaded with fuel and bombs, their 4 Wright R-thirty-three-fifty engines straining against the tropical heat. LeMay had commanded bomber operations in Europe for 2 years before transferring to the Pacific theater. He understood strategic bombing doctrine. He knew the mathematics of bomb tonnage and target destruction. He had studied reconnaissance photographs until he could identify individual factory complexes from memory. But there was one calculation that LeMay and the entire United States Army Air Force's planning apparatus had fundamentally right, while Japanese intelligence had gotten catastrophically wrong. A calculation that would determine whether Japan's home islands could be defended or would burn. Japanese intelligence estimated that American B-29 production capacity, pilot training throughput, and logistical infrastructure could support a maximum operational force of approximately 100 bombers capable of reaching Japanese targets from bases in the Mariana Islands. The actual number of B-29s that would eventually strike Tokyo in single-raid formations exceeded 1,000 aircraft. They had miscalculated by a factor of more than 10 to 1. This was not a minor intelligence oversight. This was not an error in estimating production schedules or a mistake about American strategic priorities. This was a complete failure to comprehend the industrial and organizational capacity of the enemy they were fighting. And by the time Japanese air defense commanders understood the true scale of what was coming, there was nothing they could do to stop it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The man who first recognized that Japanese estimates were dangerously optimistic was Colonel Takushiro Hattori, serving in the operations section of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Hattori was not an aviation specialist. His background was in ground operations and strategic planning. But in early 1944, he was assigned to assess Japan's vulnerability to strategic bombing as American forces advanced across the Pacific toward bases within range of the home islands. Hattori understood that once the Americans captured islands in the Marianas, they would possess airfields capable of supporting long-range bomber operations against Japan. The question was not whether such operations would occur, but rather their scale and sustainability. Could the Americans mount occasional nuisance raids that would damage morale, but not significantly impact war production? Or could they conduct sustained campaigns that would cripple Japanese industry and destroy the nation's capacity to continue fighting? The answer depended entirely on how many bombers the Americans could deploy and maintain in operational condition. Hattori requested intelligence estimates from multiple sources. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police with extensive intelligence functions, provided reports based on monitoring American radio broadcasts and analyzing captured documents. The Navy's Intelligence Division contributed assessments based on observations of American aircraft production and deployment patterns. The Army's own intelligence apparatus compiled information from attaché reports, prisoner interrogations, and analysis of American technical publications. The estimates varied, but most clustered around similar conclusions. American B-29 production was significant but constrained by the aircraft's technical complexity and resource requirements. Each bomber required approximately 40,000 individual parts and components. The manufacturing process was elaborate and time-consuming. Quality control standards were rigorous. Based on Japanese understanding of aircraft manufacturing, such a complex aircraft could not be mass-produced at rates comparable to simpler designs like fighters or light bombers. Japanese intelligence officers calculated that American factories might produce 200 to 300 B-29s per month at peak production. This seemed like a generous estimate, perhaps even optimistically high from the American perspective. Building 300 sophisticated four-engine bombers every month represented extraordinary industrial capacity by any nation's standards. But production capacity alone did not determine operational strength. Bombers required trained crews. Each B-29 needed 11 personnel: a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, radar operator, and 4 gunners. Training complete bomber crews took time. Pilots needed hundreds of flight hours. Navigators required extensive training in celestial navigation and dead reckoning across vast ocean distances. Bombardiers trained on sophisticated northern bomb sites that demanded mathematical precision and steady nerves under combat conditions. Japanese intelligence estimated that American training infrastructure could produce approximately 50 fully qualified B-29 crews per month. This assumed that the Americans were expanding their training capacity aggressively and accepting somewhat lower proficiency standards than Japanese doctrine would require. 50 crews per month meant 600 new crews annually, but combat attrition would reduce available strength. Training accidents would claim aircraft and crews. Maintenance issues would keep bombers grounded for repairs. Operational losses over Japan would destroy aircraft faster than they could be replaced if Japanese air defenses performed as doctrine suggested they should. The mathematics pointed toward a sustainable American force of approximately 100 operational B-29s, capable of striking Japanese targets from Mariana bases. Some raids might involve fewer aircraft due to maintenance issues or weather constraints. Occasional maximum effort raids might push numbers slightly higher by including aircraft normally held in reserve for training or specialized missions. But 100 bombers represented the realistic operational ceiling based on Japanese understanding of logistics, maintenance requirements, crew availability, and the challenges of sustaining combat operations across 6,000 miles of ocean. Colonel Hattori took these estimates and used them to calculate the threat level to Japanese war production. 100 B-29s, each carrying approximately 5 tons of bombs, could deliver 500 tons of ordnance per raid. If the Americans conducted raids twice per week, they could drop approximately 4,000 tons of bombs monthly on Japanese targets. This was significant but manageable. Japanese industry was dispersed across multiple cities. Factory complexes had been hardened with additional concrete protection and underground facilities where possible. Fire prevention measures had been improved throughout major industrial areas. Civil defense organizations trained citizens in firefighting and evacuation procedures. 4,000 tons of bombs per month would cause damage and disruption, but it would not destroy Japan's capacity to produce weapons, ammunition, and war material. The nation could absorb such losses and continue fighting. Hattori's assessment, submitted to Imperial General Headquarters in March 1944, concluded that American strategic bombing from the Marianas would constitute a serious but not decisive threat to Japanese war production and civilian morale. Countermeasures, including enhanced air defense, improved civil defense, and continued industrial dispersion, would mitigate damage to acceptable levels. The war could continue despite American bombing operations. This assessment was based on the best intelligence available at the time. It was methodical, carefully reasoned, and supported by multiple sources of information. It was also completely wrong. The error was not in the analysis itself, but in the fundamental assumptions about American industrial capacity and organizational capability that shaped that analysis. Japanese intelligence officers looked at B-29 production through the lens of their own manufacturing experience and limitations. They saw an aircraft as complex as any Japan had attempted to build, and assumed that complexity imposed natural limits on production rates that applied to all industrial powers equally. They were projecting Japanese constraints onto an enemy with completely different capabilities and completely different approaches to mass manufacturing. The reality of American B-29 production was something Japanese intelligence had no framework to comprehend. Boeing's main B-29 assembly plant in Wichita, Kansas, occupied 4.3 million square feet of floor space, making it one of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world. The plant employed over 30,000 workers operating in 3 shifts around the clock. The production line used assembly techniques pioneered in automobile manufacturing, but scaled up to aircraft production in ways that no other nation had attempted. Each bomber moved through 43 separate assembly stations. Components manufactured at hundreds of subcontractor facilities across the United States arrived on precise schedules and were integrated into aircraft at specific points in the assembly sequence. The coordination required to manage this supply chain involved thousands of people tracking millions of parts across vast distances. Bell Aircraft operated a second major B-29 plant in Marietta, Georgia, with similar capacity. Martin Aircraft ran a third facility in Omaha, Nebraska. Fisher Body, a division of General Motors, built B-29s at a plant in Cleveland, Ohio. The distributed production system meant that problems at one facility did not halt the entire program. If Wichita experienced parts shortages or labor issues, the other plants continued production without interruption. American industry produced 3,970 B-29s between 1943 and 1945. Peak production in March 1945 reached 399 aircraft delivered in a single month. This was more than Japanese intelligence had estimated for annual production. The Americans were building in 1 month what Japan assumed would take them an entire year. But aircraft production was only part of the equation. Those aircraft required crews, and training crews in the numbers required to sustain such a massive force demanded an organizational effort that Japanese planners could not conceive. The United States Army Air Forces established specialized B-29 training bases across the United States, including facilities in Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, New Mexico, and Georgia. Each base could train multiple crews simultaneously using a combination of ground school instruction, flight simulators, and actual flying time in operational aircraft. The training pipeline was designed for throughput rather than the careful, methodical approach that characterized Japanese aircrew development. American training doctrine accepted that crews would complete training with less total flight experience than Japanese doctrine required, but compensated through standardized procedures, extensive use of checklists, and systematic approaches to crew coordination that reduced dependence on individual expertise. A Japanese bomber crew trained for months, building proficiency through repetition and developing almost intuitive coordination between crew members who worked together throughout their training. American B-29 crews trained for weeks, learning standardized procedures that any qualified crew member could execute regardless of who else was in the aircraft. The Japanese approach produced highly skilled crews who performed superbly but took substantial time to train and were difficult to replace if lost in combat. The American approach produced adequately skilled crews who could be trained quickly and replaced efficiently as combat attrition reduced available strength. Neither approach was inherently superior. They reflected different assumptions about the nature of war and how nations mobilize for sustained conflict. Japan optimized for quality because its limited population and industrial base made replacing losses difficult. America optimized for quantity because it could afford to train replacements faster than combat operations consumed them. By September 1944, American B-29 training bases were producing approximately 200 fully qualified crews per month. This was 4 times the estimate that Japanese intelligence had calculated as the maximum sustainable rate, and the Americans were still expanding training capacity, adding more instructors, more aircraft, and more facilities to increase throughput further. The first B-29 raid against Tokyo launched from Saipan on November 24, 1944, involved 111 aircraft. Japanese radar operators detected the formation approximately 200 miles east of the home islands as the bombers crossed the coast at 27,000 feet altitude. Air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo. Civil defense teams took positions throughout the city. Fighter squadrons scrambled to intercept. The raid lasted 2 hours. American bombers struck the Nakajima aircraft factory complex in northwestern Tokyo with 575 tons of high explosive bombs. Damage was moderate. Cloud cover obscured the target and made precision bombing difficult. Several bombs fell in residential areas, killing civilians and destroying homes. Japanese fighters engaged the bomber formation, shooting down 1 B-29 and damaging 14 others. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, but largely ineffective at the altitude the Americans maintained. The raid was tactically inconclusive. The target sustained damage but remained operational. American losses were light. The psychological impact was significant. Tokyo had been bombed before in the Doolittle raid of April 1942, but that had been a small symbolic strike with 16 B-25 medium bombers that caused minimal damage. This was different. This was over 100 heavy bombers striking from bases the Americans now controlled permanently. This was a demonstration that American forces could reach Japanese cities whenever they chose, and there was nothing Japan could do to prevent it. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing the raid noted with concern that the Americans had launched 111 bombers in their first operational mission from the Marianas. This was already slightly above the estimated maximum sustainable force of 100 aircraft. Perhaps the Americans had concentrated everything available for the inaugural raid to make a strong impression. Perhaps this represented temporary surge capability that could not be maintained. The officers waited to see what subsequent raids would reveal about American operational strength. The second raid came on November 27th, 3 days later. 111 bombers again. The target was the same Nakajima aircraft plant. Results were again mixed due to weather conditions and determined Japanese fighter resistance. The third raid launched on November 29th with 107 aircraft striking dock facilities in Tokyo Bay. The fourth came on December 3rd with 94 bombers hitting the Musashino aircraft plant. The raids continued through December, with varying force sizes and targets. Japanese intelligence compiled the data carefully. The Americans were sustaining approximately 100 aircraft per raid as predicted. Some missions involved slightly fewer bombers, when weather or maintenance issues reduced available strength. The pattern matched Japanese expectations. Then, in January 1945, the numbers changed. The raid on January 9th involved 127 aircraft. The mission on January 23rd involved 134 bombers. By February, raids routinely included over 150 aircraft. Something was happening that Japanese intelligence had not anticipated. American operational strength was growing rather than stabilizing at the predicted level. Additional bombers were arriving from the United States in numbers large enough to expand force size despite combat losses and maintenance attrition. The Americans were not operating at their maximum sustainable capacity. They were still building up strength. Japanese intelligence officers scrambled to understand what they were seeing. They reviewed production estimates and training assessments, looking for errors in their calculations. The numbers had seemed solid, based on reasonable assumptions about American industrial capacity and organizational limitations. What had they missed? The answer began to emerge through multiple sources of information that converged on an uncomfortable conclusion. Prisoner interrogations of captured American aircrews provided fragments of the picture. A bombardier shot down in January mentioned that his training class at Hobbs Army Airfield in New Mexico had included 40 crews. A navigator captured in February talked about the steady stream of new aircraft arriving at his base in Saipan, sometimes 3 or 4 per week. A flight engineer mentioned, casually, that the Americans had over 600 B-29s deployed in the Marianas by early March. 600 aircraft operational in the theater meant total American B-29 strength, including bombers in training units, replacement pools, and other operational areas, was well over 1,000 aircraft. That was 5 times Japanese intelligence estimates. Japanese radar operators tracking inbound raids provided quantitative data that supported this assessment. Formation sizes continued growing through February and into March. 150 aircraft became routine. 175 aircraft represented a small raid. 200 bombers struck Tokyo on February 19th. 229 hit the city on February 25th. The escalation continued week after week with no indication that the Americans were reaching any operational ceiling. Then, on March 9, 1945, Japanese radar detected an inbound formation that seemed impossibly large. Operators initially reported the contact as multiple, separate formations approaching from different directions. When the formations merged into a single stream of aircraft flowing over Tokyo, the true scale became apparent. The Americans had launched 334 B-29s, carrying incendiary bombs designed to start fires rather than destroy hardened industrial targets through explosive force. The raid would become known as Operation Meeting House, the single most destructive air raid in human history. The bombers came in low that night, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, rather than the typical high-altitude approach above 25,000 feet. This placed them within range of Japanese anti-aircraft fire, but improved bombing accuracy dramatically and reduced fuel consumption, allowing each aircraft to carry more bombs. The target was Tokyo's densely populated eastern districts, where small workshops and home-based manufacturing operations produced component parts for Japanese industry. American planners had concluded that destroying dispersed industrial capacity required area bombing with incendiaries, rather than precision strikes with high explosives. The weather was clear and dry. Wind speeds at ground level reached approximately 15 miles per hour, enough to spread fires rapidly once they started. The bombers arrived shortly after midnight on March 10th and dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs across 16 square miles of residential and light industrial area. The fires merged into a firestorm within 30 minutes. A firestorm occurs when multiple fires combine and generate enough heat to create powerful updrafts that draw in surrounding air at ground level. Wind speeds at the edge of the firestorm reached 100 miles per hour, strong enough to uproot trees and tear apart buildings. Temperatures at the center exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and ignite materials that normally resist fire. People caught in the firestorm died from heat exposure before the flames reached them. Others suffocated as the fires consumed oxygen faster than it could be replenished. Those who sought shelter in concrete buildings often died when the structures became ovens that baked everyone inside. The fire burned until dawn. When American reconnaissance aircraft photographed Tokyo the following day, 16 square miles of the city had been reduced to ash and rubble. Approximately 100,000 people were dead, most of them civilians who had no direct connection to military operations or war production. Over 1 million people lost their homes. The Sumida River, which runs through eastern Tokyo, was filled with bodies of people who had jumped into the water, seeking refuge from the heat, and either drowned or died from burns before they could reach safety. Japanese civil defense organizations, trained and equipped to handle conventional bombing raids, were overwhelmed completely. Fire trucks could not navigate streets blocked by collapsed buildings and fleeing crowds. Water mains, ruptured by the intense heat, left firefighters without adequate water pressure to combat the flames. Hospitals filled beyond capacity with burn victims, many of whom died waiting for treatment that could never come in sufficient quantity to meet the need. The scale of destruction exceeded anything Japanese military planners had imagined possible from aerial bombardment. The Americans had demonstrated that they could destroy an entire section of a major city in a single night with one raid. And they had done it with 334 bombers, more than 3 times the force that Japanese intelligence had estimated as the maximum American operational capability. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound and immediate. If the Americans could launch raids of this size now, in March 1945, what would they be capable of by summer, by autumn? The industrial capacity that produced 334 bombers for a single raid suggested total production far beyond anything Japanese intelligence had calculated. The training infrastructure that produced crews for those bombers indicated organizational capacity that operated on a completely different scale than Japanese systems. The logistics network that delivered fuel, bombs, spare parts, and supplies to support such operations across 6,000 miles of ocean demonstrated resources that Japan simply could not match, regardless of determination or fighting spirit. Colonel Hattori, whose earlier assessment had concluded that American bombing would be serious but manageable, was ordered to produce a revised analysis incorporating new intelligence about actual American operational strength. He worked through March and early April, compiling raid data, prisoner interrogation reports, and reconnaissance information that documented American force levels in the Mariana Islands. His revised report, submitted to Imperial General Headquarters on April 15, 1945, concluded that American B-29 strength in the Pacific Theater had reached approximately 600 operational aircraft, with additional bombers arriving from the United States at a rate of 50 to 70 per month. Total American B-29 production had likely exceeded 3,000 aircraft since the program began. Training capacity was producing replacement crews faster than combat attrition reduced available strength. The Americans were not approaching any operational ceiling. They were still building up their forces and showed every indication of continuing to expand bomber strength throughout 1945 and into 1946 if the war continued that long. Hattori's analysis included projections of what this meant for Japanese cities and war production. If the Americans maintained their current operational tempo, conducting 3 to 4 major raids per week, with force sizes averaging 200 to 300 aircraft, they could drop approximately 20,000 tons of bombs monthly on Japanese targets. This was 5 times the tonnage that Hattori's earlier assessment had calculated as the maximum American capability. At that rate, every major Japanese city would be subjected to devastating raids within 6 months. Industrial capacity would be crippled. Transportation infrastructure would be destroyed. Civilian morale would collapse under sustained bombardment that offered no prospect of relief or successful defense. The April 13th raid on Tokyo involved 327 B-29s. The May 23rd raid included 558 bombers, the largest force yet assembled for a single target. Over 3,000 tons of incendiaries fell on Tokyo in one night. By June, Japanese intelligence was tracking over 800 B-29s deployed in the Marianas across multiple bases, including Northfield on Tinian, which had been expanded to accommodate 4 complete bombardment wings. The Americans were operating what amounted to an aerial siege, systematically destroying Japanese cities one after another with raids so large and so frequent that defense was impossible. Japanese fighter forces, already depleted by years of combat attrition and unable to replace losses due to industrial damage and pilot shortages, could not intercept formations of 500 or more bombers escorted by long-range fighters. Anti-aircraft defenses, constrained by ammunition shortages and targeting difficulties against high-altitude formations, achieved minimal results. Civil defense measures designed to protect against conventional bombing proved useless against incendiary attacks that created firestorms. The only effective response would have been to prevent the Americans from establishing bases in the Marianas in the first place. But that opportunity had passed when Saipan fell in July 1944 and Tinian fell in August of the same year. Once those islands were in American hands, the home islands were within range, and defense became a matter of enduring the bombardment rather than stopping it. The irony was that Japanese intelligence had possessed most of the information needed to make accurate estimates of American bomber strength long before the war reached this point. American aircraft production statistics were published in trade journals and industry publications that Japanese intelligence officers read regularly throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. Boeing's construction of massive assembly plants was reported in American newspapers. The Army Air Force's expansion of training facilities was documented in military publications and congressional budget reports. The information was available. What was missing was the fear, ability to believe that any nation could mobilize on such a scale. Japanese intelligence officers looked at American production data and assumed the numbers were exaggerated for propaganda purposes. They saw reports of massive factories and assumed the facilities were less efficient than claimed. They read about rapid training programs and assumed the crews would be inadequately prepared for combat. Every piece of information was filtered through assumptions about what was possible, what was reasonable, what made sense based on Japanese experience. Those assumptions were wrong, but they were comfortable. They allowed Japanese planners to believe that Japan could compete with American industrial output through superior efficiency and fighting spirit. They supported strategies that depended on America accepting a negotiated settlement rather than pursuing total victory through overwhelming force. They made it possible to believe that Japan could win, or at least avoid losing, a war against an enemy with 10 times the population and 50 times the industrial capacity. The intelligence failure regarding B-29 strength was part of a broader pattern of miscalculation that characterized Japanese understanding of American capabilities throughout the war. Just as Japanese naval intelligence had estimated American naval personnel strength at less than 1/8 of actual numbers, Japanese air intelligence had estimated American bomber strength at less than 1/10 of the force that would eventually strike Japanese cities. The errors stemmed from the same fundamental cause: an inability to comprehend an enemy that operated according to completely different rules than Japan understood. The United States approached war as an industrial production problem. American military doctrine assumed that superior numbers, properly supplied and adequately trained, would overwhelm any enemy regardless of individual quality or tactical skill. The goal was not to field the term best navy or the most proficient air crews, though Americans certainly strove for excellence in training and equipment. The goal was to field enough naval forces and enough bomber crews that losing individual battles or suffering heavy casualties in specific operations did not alter the overall trajectory of the war. Japan approached war as a test of national spirit and martial virtue. Japanese military doctrine emphasized elite forces achieving decisive victories through superior training, tactical innovation, and willingness to sacrifice. The goal was to fight so effectively that numerical disadvantages became irrelevant through the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit and operational excellence. Neither philosophy was morally superior, both reflected national character and historical experience. But in a prolonged conflict between industrial powers, the American approach possessed decisive advantages. Numbers eventually overwhelm quality when the numerical advantage is large, enough, and sustained long enough. Japan discovered this principle through painful experience in every theater of the Pacific War, at sea, on land, and in the air. The B-29 campaign represented perhaps the purest expression of American industrial might applied to warfare. By July 1945, the Americans were routinely launching raids with over 500 bombers. On July 24, 627 B-29s struck Osaka, Nagoya, and other cities simultaneously in coordinated attacks that overwhelmed Japan's remaining defensive capabilities. The raid demonstrated operational capacity far beyond anything Japanese intelligence had imagined possible 2 years earlier, when estimates suggested 100 bombers represented the American operational maximum. The actual force was more than 6 times larger and still growing. Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe served as commanding general of the Army Air Corps from December 1944 until the end of the war. He was responsible for defending Japanese airspace against American bomber raids. After the war, Kawabe was interviewed extensively by American military historians, documenting Japanese air defense operations and understanding how Japan assessed the strategic bombing campaign. The Americans wanted to know what Japanese commanders had understood about American capabilities and when they realized that defense was impossible. Kawabe's testimony was remarkably candid. He explained that Japanese intelligence estimates of American bomber strength had been consistently wrong throughout the war. The initial estimate of 100 operational B-29s proved inaccurate within months. Revised estimates failed to capture the full scale of American production and deployment. By mid-1945, Japanese air defense commanders had stopped trying to estimate total American strength and focused instead on responding to whatever raids actually materialized. The numbers were so far beyond Japanese expectations that precise estimates no longer mattered. Whether the Americans had 800 bombers or 1,000 bombers or 1,200 bombers made little practical difference. Japanese fighter forces could not intercept formations of that size effectively. Anti-aircraft defenses could not shoot down enough bombers to make raids prohibitively costly. Civil defense could not protect civilian populations from firestorms that consumed entire sections of cities. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved what American planners intended: destruction of Japanese industrial capacity, disruption of transportation infrastructure, devastation of civilian morale, and demonstration that Japan had no defense against American air power. Kawabe described watching formations of B-29s pass overhead in daylight, flying at altitudes beyond the effective range of most Japanese fighters. Bombers so numerous that they darkened the sky, engines, droning in a sound that became associated with inevitable destruction. He knew that every one of those aircraft represented industrial capacity far beyond what Japan could produce. He knew that the crews flying them had been trained in months rather than years. He knew that if his fighters managed to shoot down 50 bombers in a single raid, the Americans would replace those losses within a week and launch another raid just as large. The mathematics were absolute and immutable. Japan could not win an attrition war against an enemy with unlimited industrial resources and the organizational capacity to mobilize those resources faster than Japan could destroy them. The final accounting was presented in simple, brutal numbers that told the complete story. Japanese intelligence estimated maximum American B-29 operational strength at 100 aircraft based on careful analysis of production capacity, training throughput, and logistical requirements. Actual American operational strength. By July 1945 exceeded 1,000 bombers deployed in the Pacific Theater. The error was more than 10 to 1. American B-29 raids dropped approximately 160,000 tons of bombs on Japanese cities and industrial targets between November 1944 and August 1945. Over 60 Japanese cities sustained major damage. Approximately 300,000 civilians died in the strategic bombing campaign. Over 8 million people lost their homes. Industrial production declined by over 60% in the final year of the war due to direct bomb damage, disruption of transportation networks, and destruction of worker housing that forced factory workers to flee urban areas. The United States produced 3,970 B-29s during the war. Japan produced 0 equivalent aircraft. The empire lacked the industrial capacity, the advanced technology, and the organizational infrastructure to build anything comparable. Japanese intelligence had studied American bomber development carefully. They knew about the B-29 program from its inception. They read technical specifications published in aviation journals. They understood that the aircraft represented a quantum leap in strategic bombing capability with its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled defensive guns, and ability to carry heavy bomb loads across vast distances at high altitude. What they failed to understand was that America could produce such aircraft by the thousands and deploy them in formations so large that Japanese defenses were simply overwhelmed by numbers. The intelligence failure regarding B-29 strength was discovered, documented, and reported to senior leadership just as the naval personnel miscalculation had been. Field commanders sent increasingly desperate reports about the scale of American raids. Intelligence officers compiled comprehensive assessments showing that initial estimates had been wrong by factors of 10 or more. The revised analyses were accurate, well documented, and utterly useless for changing the outcome of the war. By the time Japanese intelligence understood the true scale of American bomber strength, Japanese cities were burning. The damage was done. The war was lost. All that remained was to endure the bombardment until surrender or complete destruction, whichever came first. The institutional and political structures that had produced catastrophically wrong intelligence estimates at the start of the war were incapable of preventing the disaster those estimates had made inevitable. Japanese military culture emphasized offensive spirit and decisive engagement. Intelligence organizations that warned about enemy capabilities that exceeded Japanese assumptions were often ignored or marginalized. Officers who raised uncomfortable questions about whether Japan could match American production were considered defeatist. The system rewarded optimistic assessments that supported aggressive strategies and punished realistic appraisals that suggested caution or restraint. The result was a military apparatus that went to war based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about enemy capabilities and discovered the truth only after defeat was inevitable. Wars are won and lost through accurate understanding of what you are fighting and what resources the enemy can bring to bear. Japan looked at America and saw an industrial power that would mobilize cautiously and conservatively, building forces carefully over years. They estimated bomber production using Japanese standards and Japanese assumptions about what was achievable in aircraft manufacturing. They calculated crew training throughput based on their own methodical approach to aircrew development. They prepared to fight an enemy that existed primarily in their own imaginations, an enemy that matched their expectations about how modern nations conducted strategic warfare. The real enemy operated on a scale that Japanese intelligence could not imagine, even when evidence accumulated that should have made the truth obvious. The real enemy built factories larger than entire Japanese military installations. The real enemy trained crews in weeks rather than months. The real enemy produced in 1 month what Japan assumed would require a year. That enemy destroyed Japanese cities not through superior tactics or better crews or more advanced technology, though all those factors played roles, but through sheer overwhelming numbers. So many bombers that defense became impossible. So many raids that recovery between attacks was impossible. So many tons of bombs falling on Japanese cities that survival became a matter of chance rather than preparation or civil defense. 100 estimated. Over 1,000 actually deployed. That gap between assumption and reality, between what Japan thought it faced and what actually appeared in the skies, over Tokyo, represents one of history's most catastrophic intelligence failures. The numbers were always there in American industrial statistics and production reports and congressional budget documents. The data was available to anyone who wanted to see it. What was missing was the willingness to believe that any nation could operate on such a scale. What was absent was the intellectual flexibility to question fundamental assumptions when evidence contradicted them. What failed was the institutional culture that valued optimistic assessment over uncomfortable truth. And that failure cost Japan everything. The B-29s that darkened the skies over Tokyo in the final year of the war were not surprises. They were the inevitable result of industrial capacity that Japanese intelligence had studied but failed to believe. They were the physical manifestation of American organizational capability that Japanese planners had documented but could not accept. They were proof that in modern plage industrial warfare, superior numbers properly applied will overcome superior spirit every time when the numerical advantage is large enough and sustained long enough. That lesson, learned at terrible cost through the destruction of Japanese cities and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, remains relevant for any nation that might consider war against an opponent whose industrial and organizational capacity it does not fully understand. Intelligence is not just about gathering information. It is about believing what the information tells you, even when the implications are uncomfortable or contradict preferred assumptions. The tragedy of Japanese intelligence in World War II was not that they failed to collect information about American capabilities. They collected extensive information through multiple channels. The tragedy was that institutional culture and strategic preferences prevented them from believing their own intelligence until reality forced recognition, through overwhelming violence that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.